Good evening and welcome to the new BUGAJSKI Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. As always, we have fresh perspectives on transatlantic security and European developments. And today I will be discussing international security questions with our special guest on the BUGAJSKI hot seat, Daniel Serwer, professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the director of its American Foreign Policy and Conflict Management programs. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Serbia's Place in the Russian World. President Vučić's Serbia is trying to imitate Russia. It seeks to be the dominant power in the Western Balkans and is mimicking Putin's Russian world ideology with a smaller Serbian world. But the problem for Belgrade is twofold. Its expansionist agenda will be resisted by neighbors, and its pursuit of greatness will ensure that Serbia becomes increasingly dependent on Moscow. According to Interior Minister Aleksandar Vulin, all Serbs have the right to live together in one state. Belgrade claims the right to protect Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Croatia. Just like the Russians, the Serbs are portrayed as the long-suffering victims which foreign powers are conspiring to assimilate or eliminate. But under the fraternal surface, the Kremlin is manipulating Belgrade to serve its geopolitical interests. Vučić is permanently indebted to his mentor Vladimir Putin for blocking Kosovo's entry into the United Nations and refusing to recognize its independence. Serbia's economic dependence on Russia is expanding. It is almost entirely reliant on Russian energy supplies, and this bolsters Moscow's leverage over the government. On the military front, Serbia is groomed as a military outpost of Russian power and is being armed with warplanes, tanks, and anti-aircraft systems. For Putin, Serbia provides a valuable option of stirring conflicts in the Western Balkans to distract attention from Russia's attacks on Ukraine, Georgia, and other neighboring states. At some point, Belgrade could be pushed or provoked into a military confrontation and appeal to Moscow for assistance. The dependence of the Vučić government on Putin's political support is also escalating. The Kremlin's backing of assorted nationalist groups in Serbia and its extensive influence in Serbia's information space is intended to keep Vučić in check. It signals that the Serbian leader is not irreplaceable if he tries to move away from Russia. It is time now for the BUGAJSKI hot seat with Daniel Serwer, professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and director of its American Foreign Policy and Conflict Management programs. And of course, Dan is one of our leading Balkanists in Washington, so it's a real pleasure to have him on the show. Thank you for joining me, Dan.
My pleasure.
Now, before we delve into developments in the Western Balkans, and there's plenty of them, can you give us your sort of overall view of US foreign policy under this administration, the Biden administration? In particular, where do you see significant differences with the previous administration, specifically on policy towards Europe?
I think the clear difference there is a serious, renewed commitment to NATO, both politically and militarily. And that is clear, it seems to me, to everybody, and that does affect the situation in the Balkans. Nevertheless, the administration is faced with what it perceives as threats in Asia, and it is trying to respond to those, in part by drawing down in the Middle East and Afghanistan as well. I think the main difference, though, is a difference of style. Biden is a traditionalist in preferring consistency and coherence, whereas Trump prided himself on being unpredictable and incoherent. I think the world is a lot better off with the current policy.
But is there, Dan, a distinct Biden approach, would you say, to the Western Balkans? I mean, especially in the light of the new appointments, which I think are quite significant, people with experience in the region, particularly our old friend, the ambassador to Serbia, Chris Hill, Gabriel Escobar as the DAS, and of course, Matt Palmer as a special envoy for Bosnian elections. Do you think there is a more serious approach now to the region?
Look, there's certainly a return to a more traditional policy of support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and European ambitions of the countries of the Western Balkans, all of which had really been abandoned by the Trump administration. That said, what we haven't seen is a clear plan for getting from here to there, or even the beginnings of an outline of a plan for getting from here to there. It's difficult, and circumstances are not propitious. The geopolitical situation is quite negative compared to the one that we had in the 1990s when we made so much progress in the Balkans after the wars. And we face a world in which COVID dominates in many different respects. Economies are not feeling entirely confident yet. They're growing, but they're not feeling confident. They haven't all returned to their previous levels. It's a much more fraught environment for Balkans policy, not least because Balkans is way down on the list of priorities, not only in Washington, but also in Europe generally, I would say. And the Russians and the Chinese know that and are making each in its own way, making life difficult for the West in the Balkans.
It's part of the problem. This is what I hear from the administration, that a lot of the appointments have not been confirmed by Senate in several important positions in State Department, ambassadorships, and so forth.
On the appointments, look, these are much more serious people in some sense than had previously been appointed. But more importantly, they have some clear goals. But we have to wait and see what their real plans for achieving those goals are. And somebody like Chris Hill can't address that question until he's confirmed. And confirmation's going very slowly because Senator Cruz is holding them up. At least that's my primitive understanding of the situation. And in the meanwhile, of course, things happen. And, you don't have the kind of detailed planning in place that's required to respond to Milorad Dodik, for example, or even some of what Alexander Vučić is doing and saying, or for that matter, what Albin Kurti is saying and doing.
Right. I'd like to come to that in a minute, Dan. Before we cover what's actually going on in the region, how would you characterize EU policy now towards the Western Balkans? I mean, it seems that enlargement is no longer a realistic goal, at least for the foreseeable future. And there seems to be, I don't know whether it's a change, whether it's a combination of Brexit, the end of Merkel's chancellorship and many other factors. There seems to be a vacuum in leadership and commitment and coherence in the EU. What's your view?
My view is that Europe is doing what Europe often does, which is it fragments into different pieces. So if you talk about European policy towards the Balkans, at some very general level, it exists. That is, there's an in principle commitment to European Union accession, but in practice, that's far off, too far off to be much of an incentive for politicians who have to be elected every 4 or 5 years. And you have outliers within the European Union, the Hungarians, for example, who are buddy-buddy with the worst ideas of Alexander Vučić in Serbia. You have others who are tempted by partition ideas in Bosnia and Herzegovina, keep on floating their maps, a terrible idea, one proven to be terrible and defeated over and over again, but still, you know, politicians who have a short timeline and who don't really care how practical their proposals are, they just want to be able to make proposals, will resurrect the zombie idea of partition over and over and over again. And of course, the Russians encourage that because it helps them to stake their claims in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine.
What, back to the EU enlargement policy, Dan. I mean, US officials do keep talking about the European perspective. You know, if you ask about where the region is heading, well, it has a European perspective. What does that actually mean these days if there is no, let's say, timetable or even a roadmap towards membership? I mean, look at Albania and North Macedonia, how stuck they are at the moment.
They are stuck, but there is a roadmap, and it's been approved by the EU, and there's a new process they all have to go through. They've all agreed to go through it. My personal view is that it's more important that EU membership be strictly, that the criteria be strictly applied than that it occur quickly. I don't like the idea of quick EU membership because I know how that could threaten the European Union at this point. And I think the European Union is a very good thing for the United States. I think what the countries of the Balkans have to do is to keep on raising their standards, keep on implementing the acquis, because in the end, these are political decisions, and the political window will open for enlargement in the EU. It'll open when the EU economies are expanding more rapidly than they are today, when maybe you have a different leadership in France and Germany than you have right now. Look, you know, if you want to be an EU member, what you got to do is make sure that you've implemented the acquis and that you've met the Copenhagen criteria. You know, there's a tendency to think only in terms of the acquis, but the fact of the matter is that democracy and rule of law have become extraordinarily important, and they're not judged by whether you implement the acquis. They're judged by much vaguer criteria, if I can put it that way. But we know democracy when we see it, and we know Serbia is not a democracy today, and we know rule of law when we see it, and we know rule of law does not prevail in Kosovo today. So, you know, these are the things that the countries of the Western Balkans have to fix. And I shouldn't fail to mention Bosnia and Herzegovina, whose system of government is simply unacceptable as European member. This has been made quite clear now by the Commission. And it has to be fixed. It has to be fixed not only in terms of specific laws, but in terms of Constitution. The Constitution does not meet European criteria. So go ahead, stop complaining about how far off European Union membership is and fix the damn Constitution.
Absolutely. On the other hand, you must see that in Europe itself, in the European Union, there is opposition to further enlargement, political opposition, public opposition, fear of refugees, fear of newcomers, a sort of, if not Brexits, little Brexits, at least little skepticism of further European enlargement.
Oh, there's a great deal at the moment, but I'm old enough to remember that Euroscepticism is closely correlated with the business cycle, and that when the business cycle turns up and when they need labor, things can look very, very different. And the Balkans is no serious threat to the European Union. The whole thing, the non-members today, I've forgotten the exact numbers, but they amount to a few million more Europeans than the several hundreds of millions who are already within the European Union. This is not a big problem once the political winds have changed, and the political winds will change as the tide of ethno-nationalism recedes in Europe, and as the economies perk up and liberal democracy regains some of its panache.
Okay, let's turn to the region, Dan. There are so many brewing problems, it's difficult to know where to start. But let me start with Kosovo. And before I come to Kosovo-Serbia, what is your assessment within Kosovo itself of the recent local elections? I mean, at least to my mind, Kosovo seems to have much more of a pluralistic democracy than Serbia does. If you look at the difference between the local elections and the national elections earlier this year.
I think that both Serbia and Kosovo are still in a transitional state towards democracy. The big difference is that Serbia is going in the wrong direction and Kosovo is going in the right direction. 5 years ago, Kosovo had trouble running a decent election. Now they run election after election that really meets any strict standards pretty much. And that's a very, very good thing. The media is free in Kosovo. The media is not free in Serbia. Corruption in both countries is what I would call very bad. But there's a government in Pristina that at least has convinced a lot of people that it's serious about cleaning up the situation. And there's a government in Belgrade, which clearly is not serious about cleaning up the situation. In both countries, I think the lack of an independent judiciary is an important factor. And that's the long pole in the tent when it comes to democracy and rule of law. It takes a long time to develop the kind of legal experts, the kind of commitment to integrity that an independent judiciary requires. Judges who can tell the president or the prime minister to go to hell and know that they won't suffer terrible consequences. That takes a long time, and both countries have that problem. But I do think that Serbia, the quality of Serbian democracy has declined markedly in the past few years, and the quality of Kosovo's democracy has improved.
I think it's a fair assessment. Let's look now at the Serbia dialogue with Kosovo. Again, we seem to have reached another major impasse, this time over this disputed Zajednica association for the Serbian minority. Other questions as well, but I think that's where Belgrade is placing stress. What should the Kosovo government do about this question? And will the US and the EU insist that it be implemented, that the agreement be implemented?
Well, I'm no better at predicting the actions of my own government than I am at predicting the actions of others. But my sense of the situation is this, that the Pristina government has concluded that Serbia will under no circumstances recognize Kosovo, establish diplomatic relations, and allow Kosovo into the UN, which are the ultimate objectives of the dialogue. so far as Kosovo is concerned. And in response to that dead end, the Pristina is taking a very hard line against the Association of Serbian Municipalities and essentially saying, we ain't going to do it. That was agreed to by a different government. It's what you want the most. You're not giving us what we want the most. You don't get what you want the most. And actually, that's pretty good negotiating tactics, to tell the truth. The problem, of course, is the Europeans and the Americans who will scream at the authorities in Pristina that they agreed to it in 2013, they agreed to it in 2015. They've got to do it whether they're a new government or not. I'm not sure what Korti will do about this. Alban is hard over about it, as hard over as Vučić is about recognition, about diplomatic recognition. So I think that's an impasse. And I don't think there's a whole lot of point in discussing it a lot further. To tell you the truth, I'm more and more convinced that we're not going to have a final solution, if we can call it that. We're not going to have a comprehensive agreement anytime soon. There's going to have to be some kind of interim arrangement. The interim arrangement based on the technical agreements up until 2013 actually worked pretty well. I think those technical agreements have been undervalued on both sides. I actually think that they benefit where they were implemented, and they weren't always implemented. They benefited both sides, and they benefited Kosovo in the broader sense of appearing. Kosovo was able to appear on an equal basis with the Serbian authorities and demand reciprocity as they did on the license plates recently. And that, from my point of view, is a good thing. So what kind of interim arrangement might be possible? One possibility is to continue with these technical things, but I think they've kind of outgrown that. There's a lot of chatter these days about a two Germanies interim solution. After all, East and West Germany had a problem during the Cold War, and they resolved it with an interim solution. But people forget that that interim solution involved UN membership for East Germany, and I don't really think that Belgrade is going to concede that. So those who talk about two Germanys need to remember what two Germanys really was. It was all but recognition and acceptance in the international community as an equal and sovereign state. And the big difference between two Germanys in Kosovo and Serbia is that on both sides during the Cold War, as in Korea even today, there was at least a nominal adherence to the notion that there should be reunification. And in Kosovo and Serbia, that's true on the Serbian side of the equation, but it's definitely not true on the Kosovo side of the equation. Even on the Serbian side, they want sovereignty over Kosovo, but they don't want the Albanians. And nobody I've met in Belgrade recently thinks they will ever again govern the Albanians of Kosovo. So that's a big difference, that there's no common ground on the question of reunification of Kosovo and Serbia. So two Germanys might work, but it works only with UN membership.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I certainly don't support this analogy with the two Germanys. I mean, different context, foreign imposition of East Germany, the Soviet occupation, Germany divided because of its guilt during World War II and what it did to Europe, etc. I mean, there's so many differences here. I cannot imagine how these can be compared. Plus, as you say, the aim of Kosovo is to be independent. And the aim of Serbia is, they don't even call it reunification. They would call it, we've never really let go. But it seems to me, and I think you're right, that Belgrade raises any and every issue to delay the talks, to prolong them, so there is no final resolution. Can the US and the EU break the deadlock?
I think if the EU could speak with one voice, the US and EU might be able to break the deadlock. But I despair under this commission and under these circumstances of the EU speaking with one voice. I mean, the Hungarians have a very different view, not one I share, obviously, of the situation in the Balkans than the Germans do. I mean, and what do we know about what the German view is today? Because we're waiting for new leadership. So I don't think there is any serious possibility of a comprehensive solution within the time frame that Lajčák was given to bring one home. I heartily approve of the effort to make it happen. I think extremely well of Lajčák, who understands the situation as well as any of the negotiators concerned with the Western Balkans have. But I don't see analytically where the room for a comprehensive solution is anytime before the Serbian presidential election. And even after that, I have my doubts.
Dan, what is your view on the recent statement by Prime Minister Kurti, that widely quoted, that he would vote for Kosovo's unification with Albania? We're talking about unification, if a democratic and peaceful referendum was organized.
Look, it's always been on his mind. I think it's very unfortunate. It's a subject on which I disagree profoundly with Alban. I have told him that. We've had that conversation. But you should also ask him, when does he think that referendum could be organized? And the answer is only after EU membership. So, I'm willing to let it go until then. I hope he's willing to let it go until then. Look, becoming the eastern province of an Albania whose capital is in Tirana is not what most Kosovars I talk to are interested in. Quite to the contrary. And, why should there be two countries instead of one? Well, why should there be Austria and Germany? Why should there be, Canada and the United States? I mean, there are historical circumstances that dictated that. And one aspect of those historical circumstances, apart from the very hard border between Albania and Kosovo during the Cold War, which meant that their evolution for decades was quite different, political evolution, is the presence of the Serbs in Kosovo. I believe that the Serb presence in Kosovo is extremely valuable and should be preserved, and that the only way of doing that is in a Kosovo state, not in a greater Albania.
Although some in Kosovo would say we won't be a province of Albania. Albania will be a province of a bigger Kosovo.
Yeah, well, they better discuss that. I mean, they're correct in the sense that the capital of Greater Albania should be Pristina. They're correct about that, but that ain't what's going to happen. Albania is in a much stronger position today, but even Albania should have second thoughts about it. I mean, what are the implications of union with Kosovo for Albania's NATO membership? I mean, NATO isn't prepared to extend the mutual defense pact to Kosovo. I mean, if they were prepared to do that, they would have done it, and a lot of other things wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, there's so many hurdles before we can even think about it.
It's ridiculous, to tell you the truth. And as soon as you get an Albanian politician and a Kosovo politician in the room, either they're the best of friends or they're not the best of friends, and neither is a good basis for abandoning the ambition of a Kosovo state.
Right, exactly. Particularly as how long they fought for it and defended it over the years. Why would you surrender that? On the other hand, is it surprising that with state borders now being questioned, you mentioned this partition zombie that keeps wandering around the region. Belgrade seems to, as far as a lot of people in the region are concerned, Belgrade seems to have a fairly free hand without much Western resistance in interfering in its neighbors' affairs. I mean, presumably that was also encouraging Pan-Serbianism, in other words, will encourage Pan-Albanianism.
That's absolutely the case. And Vučić has been very clear and very blunt about this, that he supports the idea of a Serbian home world, a Serbian entity. And it's been made very clear, not so much by him as by Minister Vulin, that means a state. And that's their ambition. There's no question about that. Greater Serbia is Vučić's ambition, and he's willing to be patient and wait for it, but he's also willing to interfere in the neighbors in order to try to get it. He clearly did that in Montenegro. He does that every day in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, he does it as well in northern Kosovo. The surprising thing is that this behavior, which should be anathema from the European and American perspective, has not been condemned in a serious way by the Americans, by Washington and Brussels. They're afraid that any alternative to Vučić will be worse, and they're probably right about it. Any threat to Vučić's hold on power more likely comes from the ethnic nationalist right than it does from the liberal democratic left, if I can use the terms left and right in that sense. I'm a professor. I would be prepared to take that risk, but people, diplomats and politicians worry about that kind of thing. They say, well, what's the alternative?
But so that's been used by
Vučić gets away with behavior that I think should have long ago been not only condemned, but should have been responded to.
But that's often the threat, Dan, that's used by authoritarian leaders. If accept me, because if not me, it's going to be worse. We've had that from Russia for many years as well.
Despite popular opinion, it is in fact quite difficult to get liberal democratic democracies to intervene against autocrats. I mean, and this is one of many reasons why that's the case. It's also true they care more about their own politics at home than they care about whether Vučić talked about the Serbian world yesterday. But Russia understands, Moscow understands very well that this kind of talk is appetizing, and that it helps Russia to make its claims to territory in other sovereign states. And we see in Ukraine that the extent to which Moscow is willing to go to threaten first of all, to occupy part of Ukraine, to annex Crimea, and now to threaten to go farther, testing NATO and its response. And the West is, it's not that the Americans haven't said something about it. They have. They've said, look what he's planning to do. But they haven't said what they're planning to do. And the fact of the matter is, as you know better than I do, we didn't always respond in the past to misbehavior from Moscow. We didn't respond in Czechoslovakia. We didn't respond in Hungary, and even in Poland, we were hesitant, to say the least. So, the fact of the matter is, it's up to the countries of the Balkans to push back harder against Vucic's, frankly, irredentist aims.
Mm-hmm. Bosnia in particular is at the center of this, I think, at the moment. Do you think it faces an existential crisis with Dodik's threat to abandon institutions, to set up his own army, judicial system, and so forth? Or is this just another bluff?
What Dodik has done over the years is always to try to push the threat another centimeter closer to fulfillment. So I can answer yes to both. Yes, it's another bluff, but yes, the ultimate goal is quite clear, and he's threatening the state structure, and he's serious about it. I mean, he's a more or less, let's put it this way, he's an elected leader. He's more or less democratically elected or put in power. And leaders who promise their people something, even those who haven't been elected, often have to deliver it eventually. And he's promised it over and over, independence for Republika Srpska. You might ask me, well, okay, what should be done about it? Well, first and foremost, I mean, Dodik is a menace and needs to be removed from the political scene. I hope he's removed, if nothing else, by the voters. That would be ideal. But if necessary, I think removal by the international community through some sort of process in which he is brought up on charges is not unthinkable, and that we should be thinking about it. Why should we think about it? I mean, what difference does it make? He can't do anything. Well, he can do something. He could declare a referendum in Republika Srpska and go ahead with it and declare independence, and that would precipitate war. And I have really very little doubt about that. It's not that Republika Srpska is going to declare independence and everybody's going to sit around saying, Republika Srpska isn't really independent. It's going to lead to war. And the center of gravity of that war is going to be Brčko, the way it was the center of gravity of the last war. We heard a lot more in Washington about the siege of Sarajevo, but it was Brčko that was really the center of gravity, because Republika Srpska doesn't exist if Brčko is in clear and unequivocal hands of the authorities in Sarajevo. That's why it's in this ambiguous state created by an American mediator, arbitrator. And I don't know how that war is going to work out. Last time it worked out badly for both sides because it went on for 3.5 years without a resolution. This time, I'm not so sure it would go on for 3.5 years. I think the Bosnian army has the capability to take Brčko in a day or a day and a half, and I'm not sure Republika Srpska has that capability. But that's the equation, basically. No. Can someone take Brčko quickly? This is the reason why I and others have urged repeatedly that the European troops all be put in Brčko and reinforced with British and American troops, so that the resolution of the Bosnian question is not does not happen at the point of a gun, does not happen with a fight for Brčko, but happens instead in an orderly way with international community participation. The problem there, you might say, well, is there an international community any longer? the High Representative is the High Representative of the international community, even though that's ambiguous, or he was. The Russians have essentially said he no longer represents us. We don't pay any attention to him. We don't allow his report to be officially transmitted to the UN Security Council. So de facto what's happened is that the High Representative has become the representative of the West, of European Union and the United States, which is what he was in 1995-96, to tell you the truth. It was only with time and Russian concurrence that he became something more than that. But I think we should welcome this return of the High Rep to the American-European fold. And I think we have to recognize that what needs to be done in Bosnia and Herzegovina are things that the Russians will not go along with, but they need to be done nonetheless.
Right. In that context, Dan, what is the relationship between Dodik and Vučić? Presumably, and I've heard this many times, Vučić does not want to be dragged into a conflict in Bosnia that Dodik could trigger. But on the other hand, maybe he does. Maybe you calculate that he has Russian support. Maybe he can then claim he's a unifier of Serbian lands, which goes along with this Srpski Svet program. I mean, how do you see that?
Well, I'm not actually very sure. Some time ago, when I met with President Vučić, he made it very clear that he didn't control the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that Dodik was much more a creature of his predecessors than of him. But I think what's happened in recent years is that he has gained a very large measure of control over Dodik. And he has also rearmed the Serbian military in a very significant way. And he may imagine that he could do what Milosevic couldn't, which was to intervene. That would be a really, really serious problem, it seems to me, for NATO, which is entrusted with the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, that would be a big, big problem. But Vučić may figure my forces could take Brčko in a day, turn it over to Republika Srpska, and in a week, everybody will forget about it. I think it's hard to tell. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to stop the talk about a single Serbian state.
Right. There's also, of course, Dan, the Russian factor in this. I mean, Dodik has become one of Moscow's most important allies, if not even supplicants in the region. Do you think Dodik believe he has Moscow's support in this separatist endeavor?
I think he knows he has Moscow's support in the kind of periodic flare-up of his independence talk, because it wouldn't have happened twice if Moscow disapproved. Moscow clearly controls him. It's not only happened twice, it's happened 5, 6, 7 times. Moscow is using Dodik to destabilize Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is very, very clear. Would Moscow be happy if he went all the way? Well, maybe not, but he might regard that risk as worth taking. I mean, I don't think Moscow approved all of Bashar al-Assad's moves in the last decade inside Syria. He did some things that Moscow wasn't happy with. But, 3 days later, if it's successful, you forget about it. And that's I think, what Dodik is banking on. That at some point, he'll be able to go all the way. And even if Moscow isn't happy with that notion, they won't be able to do much about it.
Well, there's another possible scenario, Dan. You mentioned earlier Ukraine increasing military pressure, and now many intelligence agencies are actually indicating that there will be a Russian invasion sometime before February, before the thaw, during the height of winter, when it's easier for tanks to move in. If that is the case, could Moscow help to engineer a crisis in the Balkans as a form of distraction from what it's doing in Ukraine? In other words, we can't focus too well on one front, let alone two fronts.
They certainly could. I think there are limits to what Moscow can manage as well. And there have been times when I have thought, and some others have thought, that they toned things down in Ukraine because things were heating up in Syria and they didn't want to be stretched too thin. Now that things are more or less in Bashar al-Assad's control in Syria, maybe they feel freer to act in Ukraine. But I think Putin prizes success. Though he portrays himself, his public image is that of a daredevil adventurer, I don't think that's his actual behavior. I think he wants part of Ukraine, but he wants to be successful at it. He doesn't want to fail. And I think he'll want to be damn sure that the West can't respond in kind anyplace else, and that he can have the forces at his disposal he requires in Ukraine. The big question is, how much has the Ukrainian army improved over these last few years, and can it hold the line against the Russians?
I wanted to turn to one more country while we have time, Dan, and that's Montenegro. It's another contested territory for Pan-Serbism, for Belgrade, and also for Moscow. As you know, Moscow has been very closely involved in Montenegrin affairs. How long do you think the multi-coalition, it's a three-way coalition government in Podgorica, how long do you think it can survive, given the differing agendas of various factions in government?
Coalition governments do survive with very different agendas. I'm not willing to predict that government will come apart. I talk to a lot of Europeans and Americans who think that, that part of that coalition, a more moderate part of that coalition, will move out of it and change the balance of power in the parliament. But, they're terrified of, re-empowering Djukanovic and his political party. So it's a little bit like the situation in Israel, where you have a government of completely incompatible forces, all of which agreed on one thing, which was to get rid of Netanyahu. That's essentially the same thing that happened in Montenegro. They don't have much of a common program, though. The more liberal side of that coalition will tell you, has told us in Washington, that we're fully supportive of NATO and European perspective. And there have been moments when there was good reason to doubt that, when information was leaked that shouldn't have been leaked, when progress on European matters was slower than it should have been. But on the whole, Americans and Europeans are loath to say that the government that came to power in the democratic election shouldn't be in power. What they're hoping is that part of the coalition will abandon the coalition and create some kind of new governing coalition.
In that context, then, Dan, what are Vucic's ambitions in Montenegro? There are parties even I would say further to the right, to the nationalist Pan-Serbianism within one of the coalitions than Vučić himself. But does Vučić have a plan for Montenegro? Does he see a sort of gradual abandonment of independence, unification with Serbia, withdrawal from NATO?
I do think that he would like to see a recreation of the union of Serbia and Montenegro. Maybe even accepting Montenegro membership in NATO. You got to remember that membership in NATO means that people who are not loyal to the West have an ear inside NATO. And the Russians are unhappy with that. So exactly what his ambitions are, sometimes I think it's to absorb a part of Montenegro. Sometimes I think it's to absorb all of Montenegro. Sometimes I think it's some kind of return to the union of Serbia and Montenegro. Greater Serbia has as many problems attached to it as Greater Albania does. And though Montenegro and Serbia have been the first to admit have, in some respects, a common history, a common language, until recently at least, a common church, still, getting politicians in Podgorica to give up their sovereignty and independence, even those who are pro-Serbian, is not going to be entirely trivial. If there's anything less, if there's a history less impressive than the history of partitions, it's the history of unions. And admittedly, the American experiment is the counterexample. But unions don't often succeed. I'm talking political unions, not the European Union. Unions don't often succeed. Even the Scottish English one is under enormous strain at the moment. I don't think that's going to happen. But having somebody as pro-Western as Đukanović in charge in Montenegro clearly is no longer to Vučić's taste.
Right. Last question, Dan, because time has flown. We're almost at the end of the show. But I don't know if you've seen recently, RTK has run this excellent 4-part documentary called Virusia on Moscow's subversion in the Western Balkans. It's actually extremely well done. If you don't, I can send you the links to the documentary itself. But the question I have is there more the Biden administration could be doing to thwart Russia's policies, particularly in the Balkans, where we have so much at stake? This is not Ukraine, where we've never had boots on the ground, which was never part of the Soviet Union. This was basically, as you know, you lived through it throughout the 90s and since. This has been part of our area of interest. To stabilize the region, to move it towards NATO and European Union. Is there more that we could be doing vis-a-vis Russia?
I'm sure there is, but the inclination is in the opposite direction. Because of the Chinese threat, if we can call it that, I don't want to overemphasize it, but because of the rise of China, the natural impulse of a great power like the United States, a very well-established one, is to hedge against and counterbalance the rise of China. And you saw that very clearly in the case of Trump, who was willing to make any deal with Putin. Biden is much more careful than that and is going sort of case by case, discussing individual issues. But I think the aim isn't all that different. It's to try to make sure that Russia doesn't fall into a subservient relationship with China, which actually is very easy to imagine because especially because the parts of Russia that border China are empty. Parts on the Chinese side of the border are not empty. And, that's always been a source of, that part of the world has always been a source of enormous friction. Russia is a declining power. I haven't abandoned the view that Russia is a declining regional power, but that doesn't mean it can't be useful to the United States in particular circumstances. And I think Biden is still looking for those circumstances. Maybe he'll find them in the Balkans. Maybe the Russians don't really care that much about the Balkans, and if they can get a broader comprehensive arrangement with the United States, they'll let the United States have the Balkans back for free, basically, in exchange for hegemony by Russia someplace else. There's a great risk there. I've had people in the Balkans propose to me that the United States recognize the annexation of Crimea in exchange for recognition of Kosovo. So there are possibilities there that I wouldn't feel comfortable with, but which are pretty obvious, and people think of the obvious.
Although I would add to that, the Russians are temporary compromisers. They'll get you to compromise, but then they'll go back on the agreement they've made anyway.
Well, you know them much better than I do, but that's my impression as well. I'd be very tough-minded in dealing with the Russians on the Balkans, on Ukraine. I think they're punching way above their weight class, and I don't think that can continue forever.
Okay, Dan, on that note, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at VOA and RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miru Pavshim.